Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to get started in just a second here. All right. So hello and welcome to the fourth week of the 2017 installment of the INSAR Summer Institute. I'm Christina Cottle, and I'm the co-chair of the INSAR Student and Trainee Committee and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Utah. I'd like to welcome you all to this week's session of the INSAR Summer Institute featuring Dr. Sue Fletcher-Watson. We're really excited to have her. This session is part of a 6-week online series presented by the International Society for Autism Research. I'd like to thank the INSAR Board of Directors for their support in this event and the INSAR Student and Trainee Committee for the dedication to organizing this session. The 2017 installment of the Summer Institute, if you haven't been following us these past few weeks, we have focused the topics on culture and diversity. The series is dedicated to this very important topic due in large part to the feedback we received from our participants. We really appreciate any feedback on the Summer Institute, especially ideas for future series. There will be an opportunity to submit feedback following today's session as well as the end of the summer. The Summer Institute was designed to provide a forum for the presentation and discussion of autism-related research topics that is accessible for people new to the field. While the Summer Institute was originally motivated by and conceptualized for early career researchers, specifically graduate students and postdocs, we are excited to invite anyone interested in autism research to listen and participate. We hope that the Summer Institute provides an opportunity for scientists and stakeholders with different backgrounds and from around the world to learn from each other and ultimately advance our understanding of autism. All Summer Institute sessions are free and accessible to attend live to anyone who has created a My INSAR account. Sessions will be recorded and available for replay following the conclusion of the entire series. For this week, our session features a presentation from Dr. Sue Fletcher-Watson. Today's presentation will focus on providing you an overview of current research in the field of bilingualism in autism, to help you understand factors relevant to decision-making about bilingualism with an autistic child, and explore some of the ways in which bilingualism impacts development and cognition. In addition, we'll reflect on the range of research methods applicable to this topic, conceptualize the research within a neurodiversity framework, gain understanding of the evidence-based information available for families, practitioners, and researchers, and then to identify future avenues for autism and bilingualism research. So before we get started, I want you to know that you can ask questions for Dr. Fletcher-Watson at any time. We will have plenty of time for discussion during the back half of the session. Ask a question at any time using the chat window in the left corner of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as possible during the discussion period. So ask a question at any time during the session, and then we will be asking Dr. Fletcher-Watson the questions after she gives her presentation. At the very end of the session, if we have time, we'll give her a few minutes and she'll be talking about career development. If you want to get some advice about career development topics from Dr. Fletcher-Watson, please post your questions in the chat window and we will incorporate them into our discussion. Know that there are background materials for today's talk. If you haven't already, you can download them at autism-insar.org. The materials define some of the key terms, list learning objectives, and provide suggested reading into the literature. Today's session was pulled together in large part by a working group of people. I'd like to thank Katie Howard, a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge, and Neil Dye, a doctoral student at the University of Connecticut, for their help in preparing the course materials for today's webinar. I'd also like to thank Marika Kaufman, who is a Student and Training Committee member and upcoming co-chair. And she will be leading our discussion section, our question and answer section later on. And then I'd also like to thank Billy for helping organizing and running the working group as well. I'm now going to turn this over to Billy, who will introduce herself with her beautiful full name, which I can't say. And she's going to introduce Dr. Sue Fletcher-Watson. Okay, Billy, go ahead.
Hello, I am Bérangère Dugard, or Billy. I'm going to introduce Dr. Fletcher-Watson. She's a developmental psychologist holding the post of Senior Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. She's an associate of the Patrick Wall Center for Research into Autism, Fragile X Syndrome, and Intellectual Disabilities, and of the Salvesen Mind Room Center to understand and resolve learning difficulties. Sue is interested in the application of psychological research methods to questions with clinical, educational, and societal impact. Much of her work focuses on tracking early development on atypical trajectories such as premature infants or autistic children, and applying this knowledge to outcome measurements and the design and evaluation of new types of support. Recently, she has initiated a number of projects in response to clinical and community demand, exploring the interface between autism and bilingualism, with a view to developing evidence-based recommendations for parents and practitioners, and to understanding the role of bilingualism in the autistic experience. Dr. Fletcher-Watson can be contacted via her website, www.dart.ed.ac.uk, and on Twitter @SueReviews. I will now turn it over to Dr. Sue Fletcher-Watson for her talk entitled Autism and Bilingualism, What Do We Know? What Do We Need to Know? Thanks for joining us, and welcome, Sue.
Thank you, Billy. I should have said to everyone to just call me Sue from the beginning. Dr. Fletcher-Watson is such a mouthful. So it's a real pleasure to be doing this INSAR Summit Institute session, and I just want to add my thanks to INSAR for putting together this program, because I think it's of huge value, and especially the fact that it's free to anyone who wants to join. And it looks to me, looking at the list on the website here, that we have a really exciting international group of people to hear about this topic, which seems very appropriate. So I will just make a start. I'm going to talk about what we know about autism and bilingualism, which is a fairly limited amount, to be perfectly honest, in terms of the actual direct evidence. But I will try and extrapolate from the small amount that we do know to try and make some suggestions for what we need to know in the future. And I want to particularly thank Billy for her contribution to the work developing this lecture, and particularly the materials which she put together, which are really excellent. Before I start, I should say something about the language that I use to talk about autism. If you're an autism researcher working in an English language context, then you'll probably be aware that there are some current debates about what is the most appropriate terminology to use to talk about autism. Lots of people prefer person-first language, so that would be something like child with autism or adult with autism. And then lots of autistic people in particular prefer identity-first language, like autistic person. It's quite difficult to know as a researcher which form of language to adopt, and so I tend to use a mix of different kinds of language. And I hope that doesn't offend anyone. It was certainly chosen in an effort to be sensitive to that diversity of opinion. So here's a little overview of the lecture. I'm just going to set the scene a little bit, sort of contextualizing the topic within the way that I approach autism research more generally. And then I'm going to focus in on some of the things that we know, or we think we know, about bilingualism and autism, about autism and language development specifically, which is obviously highly relevant, but also about some of the other dimensions that pertain to this topic, and especially the sort of criteria that it seems that parents use around decision-making around this topic when they're deciding whether to raise their autistic child bilingually or not, for example. I'll then talk a little bit, so one of the main sources of knowledge that we have in this topic, or at least one of the main reasons why people are beginning to be very interested in this topic, is because of the apparent theoretical overlap between autism and bilingualism. So I'll talk a bit about that. And then from that, I'll try and consider what research needs to be doing in the future, and sort of make some very preliminary and tentative recommendations based on the evidence that's currently available. So in terms of setting the scene, I just wanted to show this slide. So this was the response, or some of the response that I got to a tweet asking autistic people to submit pictures of themselves for me to share at the beginning of this lecture. And the reason I have it up is just to show what diversity there is among autistic people. And of course, this is this isn't even a very diverse sample because it was an English language tweeted from someone based in the UK. So, I think it's easy to forget sometimes because so much autism research has happened in English-speaking countries with predominantly white groups and often fairly limited socioeconomic groups as well, to forget that there are autistic people all over the world, and this is obviously particularly relevant when we're thinking about bilingualism. I've got a couple of fictional characters on there as well because I wanted to show how autism is represented in our kind of media, in our fiction, as well as in our communities. The other important context-setting bit that I wanted to do was just to introduce the Neurodiversity Framework, which is really a framework that I am using to contextualize all of the research that I do. So for me, I consider autism to be a difference rather than a disability. I think it's important that we all remember, and it's easy to forget depending on the kinds of groups that you're working with, that autism is not intellectual disability, though of course it co-occurs with intellectual disability in some cases, in quite a high proportion of cases, of course. But just because we contextualize autism as a difference rather than a disability, that doesn't mean that autistic people don't require and certainly deserve understanding and acceptance and sometimes adjustments from other people. I sort of consider autism in the context of a post-social model of disability, where the disability exists essentially in the space between the autistic person and their environment. So the disabling element, if you like, is about the interaction that the person with autism has with other people and with their environment. And so any effort to improve the lives of autistic people and support autistic people need to be focused on that interactional space. I have a nice disability rights hashtag here, nothing about us without us. If you're not familiar with it, you should Google it, it's great. And the other thing, as I said, diversity is very important for this topic, thinking about bilingualism. And so that means we also need to think about intersectionality and the way that autism co-occurs with other sources of discrimination. So when we're thinking about working with a bilingual group, we may also be working with an immigrant community. We may be working with a community who are in an ethnic minority relative to the rest of the society that they're living in. We may be working with a community who have different religious beliefs to the majority of people in our community. And understanding those experiences and those contexts are really essential for that research. Okay, so what do we know about autism and bilingualism? We know that about half the world's population are bilingual or more, including bidialectic people, so people who speak multiple dialects of a language. And that means, of course, about 50% of autistic people are bilingual too. Of course, bilingual, the word bilingual covers a whole range of different things. It might be more accurate to say that 50% of autistic people are bilingually exposed. It's still not entirely clear what terminology we should use to describe someone who is being raised in a bilingual environment but who is nonverbal or only has an extremely small vocabulary, small spoken vocabulary. So, and as you're all aware, I'm sure, if you're working in autism, it's incredibly challenging to measure receptive speech in those sorts of contexts as well. So, but I think it's fair to say that 50% of autistic people will therefore be bilingually exposed. Bilingualism overlaps, as I said, with these other kind of intersectional issues which need to be borne in mind. But understanding autism bilingualism is essential if we want to globalize our research and practice agenda. So if we want to be able to make recommendations that extend beyond maybe the perhaps monolingual communities that some of us might work with, we need to think outside of that specific community. The other thing to mention is that bilingualism is definitely a source of concern and to a limited extent controversy. There's controversy within the research literature on bilingualism at the moment. there are controversies in the autism research literature, and then you bring those two together and there are concerns and controversies even more so. And so this is an area in which it's important to be sensitive and reasonable in the recommendations that we make. So something that I will return to later on is the distinction between something that might be a statistically significant finding but not necessarily a clinically significant finding. So understanding when an experimental result translates into a concrete recommendation of what a parent should or shouldn't do is extremely difficult in this field. And as I say, I'll come back to that. Let's use my mouse. There we go. Okay, so that's setting the scene. So what do we know about autism and bilingualism? So we know that bilingualism is highly prevalent among autistic people. Not just at the 50% rate that we've mentioned, but in fact, Billy's work, which I'll mention a little bit later on, is starting to reveal that there's quite a large polyglot community with autism. So polyglot just literally means people who speak multiple languages, but it's often used basically to mean someone who, as an adult, has chosen to learn lots and lots of languages. We know that when we're measuring bilingualism, we need to take into account these different factors. So one straightforward thing is just measuring someone's competence in more than one language. So the size of their vocabulary, their familiarity with the grammatical rules of two different languages, and so on. But when you're measuring bilingualism, you can also measure exposure. So when did they start learning each of their languages? How frequently are they using them at the moment? Or how much did they hear them when they were learning them? So were they raised by Polish parents living in England, and so they were hearing Polish almost exclusively, perhaps, for their very early life before starting to come into contact with a second language a bit later on? And that also brings me to the type of exposure. So switching is considered very important in the bilingualism literature. Switching essentially refers to how much you have to flick back and forth between the two different languages that you speak. So if you are living in a multilingual household where you have a mother whose native language is Punjabi and a father whose native language is Urdu, then you might be switching back and forth pretty rapidly. But if you your native language is French, but now you live in the UK and you have to speak English all of the time, then you're not doing so much switching at the moment, though you might have switched a lot when you were a child. It's known that bilingualism in typically developing children does relate to some delays in linguistic milestones, but that's complicated by the fact that it's very important to measure the combined vocabulary across two languages if you want to make an accurate estimate of someone's language ability. So again, if they're speaking one language in the home and a different language in a nursery setting, there might be some words that they only know in one language, some words relating to family relationships, for example, that they only know in one language. And so if you're doing a vocabulary test, you really need to take both languages into account, which can be challenging for research. There is a large amount of literature on bilingualism generally that suggests that bilingualism confers advantages in social cognitive skills and in executive function skills, and I'll come back to that. But it's really not straightforward. So particularly recently, there have been some studies and some review papers and so on that challenge these suppositions, and the field is quite fraught because it can be very difficult to disentangle the effects of bilingualism from other effects. So, for example, if you're being raised by an immigrant family who has moved into the country where the research is taking place, and the child of that family has particularly good executive function scores that go above what you would expect for their age on a normed measure, but you could also argue that that family, by virtue of the fact that they have arrived in that country from somewhere else, maybe represent the highest socioeconomic and sort of level of their home country, and so maybe it's not surprising that their child is scoring above or at the higher end expected range for their age. So this can make it very difficult to disentangle bilingualism effects from other effects that might be co-occurring, and that's something that I'll come back to. Okay, so going into that in a bit more detail, this idea of the bilingual advantage, as I say, it's highly controversial. One of the problems in the field is there are a lot of small sample and cross-sectional studies. There's an incredibly small amount of longitudinal data. Of course, you can't do an RCT where you randomly assign children to bilingual and monolingual conditions. That would be really nice, but I think the ethics board wouldn't like it. As I say, a lot of research happens in immigrant communities, so a lot of research, published research in English language at least, so coming out mostly from the UK, the United States and Canada, will often be working with immigrant communities because those societies, with maybe the exception of bilingual, French-English bilinguals in Canada, they tend to be on the whole quite monolingual societies. So you're automatically working with an atypical group if you're working with a bilingual group. And those features make it very difficult to find appropriately matched monolingual control groups. Another issue is this focus on group differences. So most of the bilingualism literature relies on two-group rather than individual differences designs. Again, very similar to the autism literature, you know, low numbers, small samples, looking for group mean differences, which can only have limited utility in really understanding the range and complexity of the behavior. And it's very hard to compare across studies because there's a huge variability in the specific type of sample. So this study over here is working with Canadian French-English bilinguals. This study is over here is working with a range of different bilingual groups who speak, you know, 30 or 40 different languages across the sample who are based in Scotland, say. Everyone seems to want to develop their own experimental task. Everyone's got a slightly different measure for bilingual competence and exposure, and this makes it incredibly hard to draw any kind of consistent conclusions. It's very like the autism research literature. So if you're doing work on the interface of the two, good luck. So what do we know about bilingualism and language development? So just to summarize what we know about autism and language development, you know, there are differences between children with and without autism in their receptive and expressive vocabulary development. There are some specific differences in use of things like pronouns. There can be differences among autistic people in terms of their comfort with normative conversational rules, use of things like metaphor, familiarity or comfortableness with the meaning of different kinds of intonation, with instigating new conversations. Those things can all be very challenging. We know that autistic children often show echolalia, where they repeat back language, and stereotypic speech. And of course, there's a significant minority of autistic children who do not learn to speak, as well as difficulties with nonverbal communication, so differences in use of gesture and body language and so on. Crucially, when it comes to bilingualism, even though these difficulties or differences are apparent in autism, there's no evidence that if you're raised in a bilingual household, any of those difficulties are particularly exacerbated. And I've got a systematic review cited there on the slide, which is also in the attached reading. It must be noted, however, as I said before, that the quality of the evidence here is fairly limited. So really to categorically state that being raised bilingually has no impact on language delay in an autistic sample would obviously require a longitudinal study with a really quite large group, and that's something that we don't have at the moment in the field. Okay, so dimensions and decision making. So this is, I'm going to talk about a specific piece of work that I did with a colleague, Sarah Hampton, here to try and sort of take a bit more of a deep dive into the autism and bilingualism topic. So the instigation for this study was essentially a concern that we heard from both professionals and parents that bilingualism might be a bad idea for their children with autism, that it could cause confusion, that it could exacerbate language delays. And we certainly found a number of professionals, speech and language therapists and other related professionals, were advising in our context in Scotland, where English is very much the dominant language, professionals were advising to raise their children in an English-only environment. This was difficult for parents because there was a desire to maintain their home or heritage language, often for cultural or religious reasons, but also because maybe some parents weren't confident using English. So what we wanted to look at in particular was how bilingualism or decision-making might operate when you're living in a country which has a single, very dominant language, where no bilingual group would be part of a very large community. So we don't have a single immigrant community in Scotland who are consistently speaking the same second language. The slight exception might be the Gaelic community, but that's mostly in rural parts of Scotland and not very accessible from where we are in Edinburgh. We also looked at the literature and the kind of qualitative studies that are cited on this slide, looking at the explorations that they've done, and what we found was that there was very little direct comparison of families of typical versus autistic children. So there wasn't really an understanding of the extent to which the decisions that parents were making around bilingualism for their children with autism were distinct from the general decision-making that any parent might be making about whether bilingualism was the right choice for their child or for their family. So as I say, this work was led by Sarah Hampton, who's there on the slide. She's now doing her PhD at Cambridge. She did a semi-structured interview study asking about the influences on parents' decisions to raise or not raise their child bilingually, and what the results of this, what they felt the results of this decision had been. And we also did a questionnaire just to get a sense of the child's language environment and their proficiency in the languages they were exposed to. So we recruited 17 bilingual parents who had an autistic child and 18 bilingual parents who had a non-autistic child. So most of the parents were couples where the two parents spoke two different languages. So there was nearly always one parent who was a native English speaker and another parent who had a different native language. But in some cases, both parents spoke a language other than English. So both parents were Polish speakers, for example, but obviously living where we are in Scotland, they were in an English-speaking environment. That doesn't mean that all of the parents had chosen to raise their children bilingually. So what we were looking for was parents who had the capacity to make that choice for their children. That was an option that was available to them. The children were aged between about 3 and 10 years old, and we matched on various relevant variables. So it's such a small sample, of course, that matching is limited. And a huge variety of languages were represented in both groups. I don't think there were any duplicate languages, if I remember correctly. So we didn't have any two parents who had the same language combination. So just to give you a little bit of the characteristics of the sample, this is just a summary of the language exposure that parents reported. So what you can see here is that a very large majority of the typical group had significant or some exposure to a second language as well as English. And I say a second language here, but of course for some of them that could have been the first language that they were introduced to. But I'll use the term second language to refer to all of the non-English languages that the sample were exposed to. There's only one participant in the sample who really had no exposure, according to parent report, to that second language. In contrast, in the autistic group, so I'm just going to see if I can get a little marker here. Here we go. You can see that about 3/4 of the group have either significant or some exposure, but there's still about 1/4 of the sample who've had no exposure. So that's one clear difference between our samples here. So the next question we were interested in was whether this exposure was something to do with proficiency. So were the autistic children who showed some kind of language delay less likely to have had two language exposure? In other words, were parents, if they could see that their child with autism had language difficulties, was that influencing their decision to maybe drop the second language if they'd started off raising their child bilingually. So if you look at the data from the typically developing children here, you can see that it's almost all orange. Almost everyone in the sample were fluent English speakers, and their exposure, most of them had been exposed to mostly their second language, in other words, the non-English language. A few exposed to slightly more English than their second language, and there's one child here who had only been exposed to English. Much more complicated data set from the autistic group. So first of all, you can see with the color codes here that their English proficiency ranged from non-verbal to knowledge of single words, short phrases only, multi-part sentences, complex grammar, up to fluent. So it's interesting to note that all of the children who were rated as fluent in English were also in the majority non-English language exposure group, which suggests a possible tentative relationship between having good language skills generally and also your parents choosing to raise you bilingually. But you can also see a distribution across the group. So if you look at the blue sections, for example, these are the children who are non-verbal. There are three who are only being exposed to English, but there's one each in the majority English and the majority non-English groups who were getting bilingual exposure as well. And I'll come back to some of the reasons why that might be. This next graph shows us something about the balance of proficiency across the two languages. So what we see again in the typical group, and again this is color-coded by English language fluency. What we see in the typically developing group is lots of kids who have balanced proficiency between English and their second language, and a few kids who have some proficiency in their second language, and just one child here who's got the greatest proficiency in their second language. Again, a more complicated picture from the autism sample. Unsurprisingly, all of the non-verbal children are also rated as having no proficiency in their second language. What's interesting here, though, is that those proficiency questions are obviously being interpreted in terms of spoken language. What was very hard to capture in this study was what their receptive language might be like. So if you ask your child to go and get their shoes in English or in whatever their other languages that they're exposed to, are they just as likely to understand that instruction in both languages or in one language more than another? And that's something that we weren't really able to capture because our measure was much more focused on expressive rather than receptive language. The other thing that's interesting here, so if you look, for example, at the three children who just have single words, there's one who's described as having no proficiency in their second language, but there are also children who've got equal balanced proficiency across two languages or greater proficiency in their second language who are also single word users. So again, not such a, there's more diversity than you might imagine, where parents, even whose children have limited language abilities generally, are still exposing them to two languages, and they still seem to be picking up those two languages. Okay, so that's all the quantitative language survey data. I'm now going to talk about our qualitative results from the interview study. So the first thing to highlight is that when we compared across the two groups, and I should say that the way we did this was that we did a thematic analysis on the interviews with the parents of typically developing kids, and then we basically attempted to squish all of the themes that came out of the interviews with the parents of autistic children into the same themes, and we saw what there was that just didn't fit into those themes, and that created a separate autism-specific theme. But first of all, I'm going to focus on the common themes, and the pink arrows here highlight the themes and sub-themes where the same theme was represented across both groups, but there were some slight differences in the details of how that was represented. Okay, so just to emphasize, there was a lot of shared territory between the groups. The majority of what the parents said, regardless of the autism status of their child, was kind of common ground. All parents noted both potential positive and negative effects of bilingual exposure for their child, and pragmatic influences on their decision-making were really, really prevalent. So lots of parents' decision about whether they were raising their child bilingually were mostly to do with how confident they felt speaking in English. Lots of parents had given up on bilingualism because their children just weren't very enthusiastic about it. What they had already done with the older siblings, if there were older siblings in the family, was a massive influence on what they were deciding to do with their younger children. So there's a lot of just very practical stuff going on in families when they're making this choice. Okay, but looking at some of the nuanced differences between the typical and the bilingual group in this study, this is focusing on the benefits seen and looking at the effects particular to children with autism. So one parent here talks about how he very explicitly thought that the benefits that accrued for bilingual people about having better thought, problem-solving skills, lateral thinking, that sort of thing, he says, he was hoping that they would be really beneficial also to his autistic child. But there were also some more autism-specific benefits that were cited. So this mother talks about how that maybe bilingualism is a safe way of explaining that different people have different rules and different languages have different rules, and that's okay, which struck us as a very kind of autism-relevant manifestation of how bilingualism might provide benefit to a family. Other benefits that were also quite concrete. So the same mother talked about how she would give her child in French a multi-step instruction, but then she would ask her to repeat it back to her in English. And so that would be a way of ensuring that her daughter had processed the instructions and really understood it. Another mother talks about how her son had to go a bit further to make himself understood. So this is a child who was non-verbal or minimally verbal, but he knew that his grandmother, the mother of the woman doing the interview, didn't speak English, and so he would make an effort to show her things. So he would take her to the bathroom if he's talking about the bathroom, just to make her understand. So that kind of theory of mind related skill of understanding someone else's point of view or someone else's perspective and adapting your behavior to improve communication is obviously something that was really apparent in that case. Thinking about family characteristics and relationships, there were some people who were very sort of didn't think there was anything autism specific here, like the first quote on the slide. I think with both my daughters, both the autistic one and the neurotypical one, I can only see benefits. But we also heard from people who felt completely the opposite. This father said, I don't think it's a good idea to try several languages. It's hard enough with the single one. And a key difference between the two children here is that Isla's daughter was quite intellectually able and she had no learning disability, whereas Baptiste's son had a learning disability as well as autism. And so that seems to be, unsurprisingly, quite a key characteristic that might change the way a parent approaches bilingualism. Another thing that was really very important that came out of the interviews with parents of autistic children was thinking about sort of family bonds and affection within the family. So this Russian mother was talking about how she used Russian when she was cuddling her child, when she was giving the child kisses, that she uses it obviously as a form of affection giving. And it's easy to imagine how a recommendation that she should switch to using English might have a negative impact on that important kind of family bonding role for Russian within her family. There's also this Italian mother who says, sometimes I would like to say something to her autistic daughter, and sometimes I stop, because sometimes I'm worried to say things incorrectly so that she learns things incorrectly. From the emotional point of view, I find it quite frustrating because I would like to say more things to my daughter and communicate more in my language. So this is a mother who'd chosen, following her daughter's diagnosis, to switch to using just English in the household. But because English was her second language, and because she was really aware and concerned about the possibility of language delay or language difficulties in her daughter, she was trying really hard to model totally correct English and as a result sometimes not saying anything at all if she wasn't confident she could say it accurately. And again, you can imagine how this well-meant recommendation of switching to just English in the family home could actually have quite a negative impact on that mother-daughter relationship. A theme that was raised by all the families was the influence of others, but it was manifest quite differently depending on whether parents had an autistic or a non-autistic child. So in the TV context, parents talked about how there was an influence of other people in the local community from whom they sometimes felt disapproval if they were out and about in local shops or in the park and they were not speaking English. And so that was a sort of pressure to maybe speak more English in their family and less of their home languages. But on the other hand, the kind of broader family would often be disapproving if they hadn't taught the home language, the native language. So these are very kind of community-based, family-based influences. In contrast, in the autism context, there was much more, unsurprisingly, contact with professionals, with speech and language therapists, who had made quite concrete recommendations, though they weren't consistent. So we have one mother here, Zahid, who says that she was told that it would be better to concentrate on one language to avoid making things confusing. But another mother here says it's not going to make any impact if we start speaking English to him. He's not going to learn language better or faster. So she told us, this is the speech and language therapist, she told us to just keep doing what we're doing, so just use Polish at home. So clearly professionals in this context are giving quite different advice, and it's intriguing to know what that might be based on. Okay, so coming to the autism-specific theme, this is basically all of the data that we couldn't fit into the model that we'd already developed from the interviews with parents of children without autism. First of all, there were some specific concerns about harmful interactions. So one is that exposure to multiple languages could be confusing. And there was also an issue where, at the point of diagnosis, the importance of bilingualism was just completely kind of eclipsed by that new piece of information. So this father says, at the beginning it was important, meaning it was important to raise his son speaking 2 languages. Then suddenly it's obvious that David's got some speech difficulties, so it went between what I wanted, which was him to be bilingual, and what was necessary for him. And then another mother said just very succinctly, I don't care, I just wish she would speak. So there are other issues going on in families' lives that really eclipse this issue of bilingualism. It starts to be seen as maybe the icing on the cake rather than something more essential. There was also a sense that raising a child bilingually could be a real burden for the family. And this is something that we heard, that you read about a lot in the literature. It's actually very hard to raise your child bilingually. It's quite effortful, and you have to really stay committed to using a language, especially if you're not in a community group where that language is being used a lot. And so various parents said, that there's so much other stuff going on, so many challenges that you're going through. Why would you also add an additional language to that? There was also the specific issue that interventions in this community were being delivered in English, so it made sense to reinforce that. Though on the other hand, this father says, it's been difficult, but having a child with autism is always difficult, and I don't think it's made it more difficult in comparison. That's a father who chose to raise his son bilingually. Okay, so that was quite an in-depth look at a data set, but I think it's an interesting data set because it reveals so many of the dimensions that are really essential in this field and really need to be understood if you were going to design good studies and also interpret the results of those studies accurately. So as I mentioned right at the beginning of the lecture, what's a statistically significant difference in an experiment, but whether that translates into, going to a particular mother and saying, you should stop speaking Italian to your daughter now and start just using English, is quite another matter. So there's a kind of key message here, which is that parents are a bit kind of lost. That there are some practitioners, at least, who are advising against bilingualism, though, as we've seen, that's not across the board. But that removing that native language can have negative implications for family interactions. and that we need more empirical evidence that's methodologically strong to be able to input into this debate. Okay, I'm just going to think a little bit now about the theoretical overlap between autism and bilingualism, which is a really strong motivation for studying this area. So, as I've said, there are some advantages associated with bilingualism in the non-autistic population. So, some specific examples from the social cognitive domain include better detection of violations of conversational rules, enhanced performance on kind of classic theory of mind type tasks and perspective-taking tasks. And there are also some associations between bilingualism and sort of broader socio-emotional health, perhaps mediated by having kind of strong family and cultural connections and being part of a kind of strong community group. There's some tentative evidence, as I say, from the limited studies on autism and bilingualism directly, that these social cognitive advantages are recapitulated in the case of autism. So there's some suggestion that autistic bilinguals might have a higher total production vocabulary, that they score higher on the social interaction domain of the Vineland, and that they may have increased use of gesture. As I say, this evidence is quite tentative but extremely promising. The other big domain that's associated with a bilingual advantage in the typically developing population is an executive function advantage. Now, this is really controversial. So there's been some pretty fierce debates in the bilingualism literature about the extent to which bilingualism genuinely promotes executive function. So, for example, looking at the specific task of type of inhibition task or the specific type of task switching task can really dramatically vary whether or not an advantage is found. One of the conclusions that's been drawn, or one of the attempts that's been made to try and summarize the really kind of varied findings from the bilingual literature, is that the bilingual advantage, if it exists, may be more sort of overarching. So rather than it being a specific advantage in inhibition or in task switching, for example, it's about a kind of continuous monitoring process or a proactive control process that is particularly apparent with multi-part complex executive function measures rather than kind of isolated specific skills. And this actually mirrors one of the attempts that's been made similarly to try and integrate the broad literature on autism and executive function, which suggests that to the extent that autistic people experience disadvantages on executive function tasks, it's likewise a kind of overarching disadvantage where tasks are open-ended or poorly structured rather than a difficulty with any specific subskill within the executive function array. And so that suggests in a funny way that even though each literature is quite equivocal and complex, there could still be this kind of good match between the advantages that are promoted by bilingualism and the challenges that are experienced by people with autism. So does that mean that bilingualism could even be promoted as a kind of natural intervention? Certainly, there are some very high-profile cases of autistic people who have learned multiple languages, often self-taught, and gained a lot of enjoyment, apart from anything else, from that experience. I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves here is the extent to which autistic learning could be fundamentally different from the learning style of a typically developing child. I don't think that's something we understand well. But I do think that sometimes our approach to teaching children with autism is based on quite a kind of narrow, almost a kind of conditioning model. You know, we're going to repeat this skill and practice over and over again, and we're going to give you a reward when you achieve this skill. It's very kind of broken down and incremental. But actually, to the extent that we can learn something from those autistic people who have developed, you know, extremely specialized and sophisticated skills in their area of interest, what we often find is that the way that those skills have been learned is by being completely immersed in their specialist interest, in their topic, in their context. And so there's a question here about whether a bilingual environment as an extremely immersive learning experience, not at all a sort of incremental skill teaching environment, might be particularly tailored to autistic learning styles. So that raises the question of whether being raised in a multiple language environment could be a sort of optimum learning opportunity for a child with autism. You know, you're taking away this kind of individual therapeutic time issue, and you're providing a kind of 360-degree, 24/7 learning environment. And that makes me wonder whether bilingualism could succeed in promoting not just the valuable and important and fascinating skill of speaking more than one language, but also help to promote social, cognitive, and executive function development in a way that other support approaches have been less successful. Okay, so that's a little bit about what I think we know about autism and bilingualism. As you have seen, it's a fairly limited amount and often based on quite small samples and quite kind of narrow range of different methodologies. But I do think we can extrapolate from this to what we ought to be looking at next and begin to make some tentative recommendations. So here are a few kind of known unknowns, the things that we know we don't know about autism and bilingualism. We don't really know how bilingualism in any group, an autistic or a non-autistic group, modifies social development over time. As I said right at the beginning, a lot of studies are cross-sectional, very few longitudinal studies out there, and understanding how access to multiple languages changes the onset and the maturation of social developmental skills is absolutely essential. Not least because, of course, if we wanted to be able to make any kind of clinical or educational recommendation, we would want to also understand whether bilingualism was likely to have different kinds of effects, whether it was accessed at different key points in development. So it may be that there are critical windows where access to more than one language could have an enhancing effect on social cognition, but learning a second language later in life would perhaps not have that same kind of impact. As I mentioned in our interview study, we found a little bit of variability in what parents reported they'd heard from clinicians, and it's really not clear what clinicians really think about bilingualism and also what sources they're using for their knowledge. It could be that clinicians have observed over kind of long years of clinical practice effects of bilingualism that we're not currently capturing with our data. And so I think it's really important to tap into this body of expertise and use it to design our studies. What are the factors that should influence parental decision making? So the only thing I could say really confidently at the moment is that there's certainly no one-size-fits-all recommendation that could be made. I wouldn't walk out to a bunch of parents and say, you should start, hire a nanny who speaks Flemish as soon as possible so that your child has access to a second language. But nor would I say to a family, oh, no, you need to drop Italian as soon as you possibly can and stick to just English. So it's really unclear what kind of factors parents should use to weigh in on this decision making. In particular, I think it's really important that we discover whether there are circumstances where actually it is possible to say categorically that bilingualism is just not advisable. Is there a subgroup of children who either have very delayed language or perhaps actually are just on the cusp of having pretty good language development where bilingualism might be just the tiny little nudge that they don't need that kind of ends up hindering their language development and tipping them over some kind of threshold. If there is a cognitive difference associated with access to bilingualism in autism, so if being raised in a bilingual environment does improve social cognitive skills, it does change performance on theory of mind or perspective-taking tasks, or it does improve executive functions, how big a difference do we need that we would be willing to say to someone, okay, you need to make a difference to your practice here. You need to go and you need to introduce your child to a second language, or you need to cut out that second language. And that's extremely difficult to weigh in the balance, because those things, they're measured on profoundly different scales. And if bilingualism is beneficial, or if it could be beneficial, is there an optimum form of bilingual exposure that would be valuable? So I mentioned already the possibility of a particular critical period in development, but it might also be that the type of access is important. So is it important for a child to experience a lot of switching between languages? That has a theoretical link with executive function enhancement, the idea that you're constantly having to inhibit one language and promote another one and switch back and forth between the two. It's almost like a brain training program for executive function. On the other hand, if bilingualism could provide benefits in terms of providing this sort of explicit and overt marker that other people have different knowledge, perceptions, thoughts, beliefs than you do, then it might be really important that there's a kind of constant match between the language that's being used by a particular person. So I know a single mother who is raising her child bilingually just by saying everything twice, right, which is an extraordinary commitment to bilingualism. But it might be for an autistic child, if we wanted to get the social cognitive benefits we think might be associated with bilingualism, that actually you'd need to have that one-to-one match where daddy always speaks Urdu and mummy always speaks English, for example. And then that kind of marking of those two different people and those two different perspectives is what gives the social cognitive advantage. So these things need to be tested and also explored theoretically to see which is the most plausible. In any study that's being designed that specifically addresses bilingualism and autism, or even just a study that's addressing something completely different, but where you expect perhaps some of the sample to be bilingual or to be bilingually exposed, here's just a list of some of the dimensions that you need to take into account. So important aspects of the cognitive profile, but also just as important family factors, relationships within the family, their religion and cultural system, and language proficiencies among family members will impact family decision-making, but also things like the design of assessments that you use in your study. You also need to think about societal factors. So are you working with a group of bilingual people who are living in a sort of bilingual community, maybe in a Mexican community in the United States, for example? And so is bilingualism an important part of access to that specific community, or an important part of access to services? Or conversely, is it a hindrance to access to services? Okay, so I just want to end by making a few recommendations at these three different levels, the community level, the practice level, and in academia. And just to contextualize this, I've just brought up this figure from the Future Node Together report that was published by Liz Pelicano that many people may be familiar with. It's a really excellent report, and you can download it for free. So they divided autism research into these different areas and used this kind of framework to analyze published and funded research. And what I really just wanted to highlight was the way in which bilingualism could be considered at almost all of these 6 levels. So not so much causes, I'll come back to causes. So here's some examples. At the diagnostic level, we might want to think about how we can identify autism in children who've been raised in a bilingual environment. This is something that I know clinical colleagues here in Scotland find very difficult. Nearly all clinicians are monolingual English speakers, and assessing a child's language delay and social skills in the context of something like an ADOS is very, very hard, or is made a lot harder when that child hasn't been raised in an English-speaking environment, and so you're trying to work out whether what they're saying is contextually appropriate and how they're interacting with their parents and their peers and so on. And also, of course, think about bilingualism at the kind of level of biology and brain and cognition. And I have a picture up here of Billy to remind me that this is what she's doing in her PhD, which is very exciting, looking at the impact of bilingualism at a neurological level in autistic adults who speak multiple languages. Genetics, I'm not really sure. I couldn't think of any examples for genetics. You can tell me if you can think of any at the end of the talk. In terms of treatments and interventions, I've talked about bilingualism as possibly creating a protective environment, but of course we shouldn't forget that bilingualism is just a really great life skill for people to have. It makes a difference to your choices about where you might live in the future, your employment opportunities, and so on. And it can be a way of meeting people and building communities. In terms of service design and provision, we need to understand, as our society becomes more multicultural, we need to understand service access for bilingual people and think about the best way to provide language education to people with autism. And of course, we need to recognize the overlap between the topic of bilingualism and societal issues. So how do we support autistic immigrants and refugees? And another reference to Billy's fantastic PhD here, we've been exploring polyglot communities, so communities of autistic people who speak multiple languages, who have built, it looks like there's some kind of really great international communities of people with that shared passion for language learning. And of course that can be a fantastic opportunity for people to enhance their quality of life and just be happy, and that's what we want. When it comes to parent decision making, just as a kind of summary of, I think, the recommendations that we can make, at the cognitive level, I think we can say quite confidently that bilingualism isn't harmful, or at least not globally harmful, and there's a theoretical argument that bilingualism can provide some kind of therapeutic opportunity, but we know that the evidence is very weak. So there's nothing really kind of concrete that we can say here, and that makes actually these two other levels, family and community, even more important. So if I was talking to parents about whether they should raise their child bilingually, or whether they should continue to speak more than one language with their child following diagnosis, these are the sorts of questions that I would ask them. You know, I would ask them about whether they were confident speakers of both languages. I would ask them about the role that their home language played in their family bond. I would ask them about their stress levels and their well-being, and whether they thought that abandoning their home language would increase their stress or reduce their stress, which of course would be different for different people. I would also ask them about what language their local services were being delivered in, what languages their child's peers were speaking, and whether they would be able to form kind of good peer relationships, and whether that would be affected by the languages that they were able to speak. And I would ask about things like their religious and cultural beliefs and the role that they play in their community and in their family. And I think those are the bases, really, in the absence of stronger evidence one way or another, on which a parent should make a decision. Let's go to the next slide. Here we go. Just to, in terms of academic recommendations, I think these are the kind of problems that we need to overcome. So research to date has focused on parent report measures and interviews, including our own study. Lots of small sample size studies, often working with very different types of groups of autistic people, different ages, with and without learning disability, different language levels, and so on. There's also a huge variety in the type of language exposure they've had in terms of bilingual language exposure. And this makes it incredibly difficult to capture individual differences and understand the kind of range of what's going on, instead of just focusing on sort of generalized statements. There's been a bit of an over-focus, I think, on vocabulary as the most important thing to measure as an outcome of bilingualism. But I think it's really interesting to explore more the impact that bilingualism might have on the social uses of language, so the way that language is being used rather than just the vocabulary of the individual. So in terms of next steps, I think we need to have more longitudinal designs incorporating clinician perspectives, more direct assessment of children, not just parent report measures, and we need to aim for some large samples so we can capture individual differences. I'd like to see more use of innovative methods to understand what sort of bilingual competence children have, even if they're not speaking or they have a very small spoken vocabulary. And I think we need to integrate into these kind of cognitive and experimental studies other variables, including things like access to services and community factors. And with all this in mind, we're starting a study in January. We just had this funded on investigating whether bilingualism offers an advantage for children with autism. And this is going to be a longitudinal study recruiting. We're trying to recruit 88 autistic children and their families for a whole battery of assessments across all of these domains at one time point, and then a follow-up 12 months later. And we'll be looking at how their particular autistic profiles and their language exposure predict change in these kind of key factors. And there's a specific sub-question about whether bilingual exposure results in bilingual ability, even in those children who have limited expressive language level. So that's me done. I'll stop there, and I think we can take some questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher-Watson, for a great presentation. That was a wonderful presentation on autism and bilingualism. So this is Marika here, and now it's time for our question and answer session. And throughout the presentation, we received a number of great questions, so we will start to go through some of those. And if you have any questions while we're going through the question and answer session, please feel free to go ahead and ask them in the little box on the left. All right, so I'll look at some of these. We had some questions about family, and we had one question about how the results seem to imply that the family makes the choice to raise a child bilingually. However, we did have a question about what about in scenarios where the parents do not speak the predominant language of their culture? So for example, if the parents don't speak English, but the child learns English in school, what kinds of implications might you see?
I think that's an incredibly that's actually quite a worrying example, and that's something that's quite common here in the UK, where, as I said, English is really, predominant language, and it's a very monolingual society. So there are some parents that we've worked with who are in this position, and it's incredibly challenging. We worked with one family, so they didn't participate in our study because their English language wasn't proficient enough to participate in the study. But so they were friends of someone who did participate in the study, so we really heard about their experience secondhand. But what they were talking about was how this family had been advised to just use English with their child, and their child was learning English at school, but they didn't actually have great English themselves, and as a result in the home, they weren't really talking to their child at all. And this was a large family, and the autistic child was the youngest person in the family. So you ended up with a situation where the family was sitting around having a family meal and all speaking their original home language, and the autistic child just didn't necessarily understand and was not really being spoken to. That kind of story, when you hear it, is completely heartbreaking, and I think a really strong motivation not to insist that people speak English with their child. That said, looking at the question, it's important to recognize that doesn't mean that so there could be a situation where a child is speaking English in school and speaking, say, Polish at home. No one's insisted one thing or another. That's just the way the situation works. I think then what we need to think about, or we need to understand more about, is how a child with autism might learn English very much as a second language in that situation. So if they've been raised speaking Polish at home, maybe hanging out with extended family or a Polish community in the town where they live, and then they really only start to confront a lot of English speaking when they reach school, what I don't think we know is the best way to help that child learn that language, and whether you would adopt the same approach that you would with a child with English as a second language who was not autistic. So that's a key question for education services that I think we don't have the answer to yet.
Great, thank you. And this next question is also has some implications for the family within the home. This person asked, when using visual supports in the home with text, is it appropriate to utilize the household language if it differs from the language that's being used in school? Can this differential become detrimental?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I would have thought, I would have thought that you should use, so for any kind of text-based supports, you should use the language that is also being spoken in that context, because otherwise that mismatch would surely be confusing. So if you're using a text picture exchange communication system, if you're using a text symbol with an image of a glass of juice and it says juice underneath, but then the person you're giving it to is not using the word juice because they're using a different word in a different language, that mismatch seems to be a problem. The difficulty there is that I know that good practice for text would be that a child would have a kind of single text folder that they would be using across context, so using in the school context and in the home context, rather than switching back and forth between different folders or different communication support systems across those two settings. So, yeah, it's not a very good answer, isn't it? But I think that's because I don't know the answer. I think it's a tricky question. I'm not certain what the right answer is. More evidence needed.
Yeah. And and that, it sounds like what you're saying is try to match it with the context if possible, but we should research that so that we can know better.
In a nutshell.
Yeah, and then we have some questions about kind of language and cultural differences as well. And so one question was, does there seem to be a difference in dual language acquisition in children with ASD when they're raised in a country that has two predominant languages, so like French-speaking Canada compared to countries without a consistent second language spoken?
So I don't think we have data on this at all. I don't think we have enough data to really be able to answer that question. The resources needed to do a direct comparison of an autistic group in a bilingual, completely sort of bilingual society versus a society like Scotland where, you know, if people speak a second language, it could be any one of about 100 different second languages. You know, that would be a very big, expensive study to do, and it would be an important study to do. But no one's done it yet, for sure. I mean, I think probably what's relevant to say here is that this is an area where data sharing and resource sharing is absolutely crucial. I think working with other research teams to try and have unity of measurement across different studies so that we can start to compare different data sets internationally would be incredibly useful and important, so that we can, even if we can't design one study to address that question, we can start to look at that in an analysis later on, or in a meta-analysis. The other thing I would say, though, is that what I do think is known and important is that in terms of decision-making when you're raising a child in a country that is essentially a bilingual country or a bilingual region, I think that vastly simplifies things, because if you're in a context where everything is set up to be bilingual, where education is delivered in dual languages, where, you know, just everything like road signage and stuff like that is in two languages, where everyone speaks both languages, I think that vastly simplifies the problem or the challenge for parents and for practitioners because it's completely the norm. And I think the dilemma is much more acute for those families who are living in a society which is quite a monolingual society.
Great, thank you. And we've gotten a few more questions asking questions about parents. And one question is if you have any specific recommendations for parents raising young children with ASD in terms of simultaneous or sequential exposure between majority and minority languages. So for example, if Spanish and English are both spoken and English is the majority language.
So, sorry, can you repeat the question because
I
think I missed it. Yeah, sorry.
Absolutely, yeah, no problem. So this person is wondering if you have any specific recommendations for parents who are raising young children with ASD in terms of whether the language is introduced simultaneously or sequentially between the cultural majority language and minority languages.
Yeah. I don't have specific recommendations for simultaneous or sequential introduction because I don't think we know enough, even in the general bilingualism literature, let alone the autism-specific literature, about the differential effects of simultaneous versus sequential introduction of languages. And there's also some kind of nuance here. So languages can be introduced sequentially. So you hear one language from birth and a second language is introduced when you're maybe 3 or 4 years old, but you're young enough that actually when you get older you would be indistinguishable from a simultaneous bilingual who'd heard both languages right from birth. So I don't think there is a specific recommendation, and I would say that actually what should influence that decision is what works for the family. So if using both languages from the get-go is working for you and fits with your family model and your context, then I just think you should go for it. And if you really want to just stick to one and then think about introducing a second language later on in development, then that's also fine. You know, the bottom line is that there isn't strong enough evidence one way or another to say that you should fit your behavior to the evidence. Instead, I think you should fit your behavior to your child and to your context.
Great, thank you. And in terms of parent coaching or parent intervention, when families are working with children, with ASD, especially young children, have you had any experiences where a clinician coaches a parent who's speaking a different language to their child, potentially a language that the clinician doesn't understand? And do you think that a clinician can implement parent coaching adequately if they don't understand what the parent is saying, the actual language?
Yeah, I don't think that you can probably get a satisfactory relationship between a clinician and a parent family if they're not speaking the same language. And I think this is one of the biggest motivations there might be to switching to a single dominant community language for families after their child is diagnosed, is wanting to integrate with services. I've tried, so I tried coding some parent-child play samples of children with autism and their parents that were recorded in Norway. And I tell you can't do it. You can't code it. It's so important. It's so important to understand what's being said, because actually the appropriateness of the language to the context is really essential. It's not enough to hear that there's been a verbalization and to observe whether there's eye contact or a gesture or something going along with it. You really need to understand whether that verbalization, whether it was even a real word or not, and whether it was relevant to the context and what it was referring to be able to make an accurate judgment. And I think the kinds of therapeutic support being offered by practitioners are in the same kind of ballpark. I just don't think you can take the language knowledge out and still deliver a really good service to that family.
Great, thank you. And we've had a couple of questions asking about bilingualism as a treatment. So I wanted to put a couple of those together. So one person asked, can you talk a bit more about how bilingualism might work as a treatment, and then whether foreign immersion programs might, if those have been used potentially as treatments for children on the autism spectrum.
Okay, so in terms of how bilingualism might work, essentially the theoretical models from the bilingualism literature with typically developing children, they're often variations on a sort of brain training model. So the idea is that bilingualism, particularly if you are switching between languages quite frequently, means that you have to work very hard to monitor who you're talking to inhibit one language and use the appropriate language, to sometimes find an item of vocabulary that you might use more commonly in the other language. So you have quite a strong prepotent response there to use, to refer to mother in French, but you're talking to an English person, so you have to remember to say mother instead of maman or whatever. So there's this idea that bilingualism is this like constant sort of brain gym, if you like. I know the brain doesn't really work that way, but this kind of constant exercise program for your frontal lobe, and that's what promotes executive advantages in bilingual children. So in that context, there's no reason to imagine that the same advantages might not accrue to a child with autism as to a non-autistic child. In terms of the social cognitive advantages, the argument is slightly different, which is the idea that people who are speaking more than one language often have to work harder to make themselves understood and to understand other people. And so, again, it's a kind of practice-based model, the idea that you have to closely monitor the conversation, you have to understand the conversational rules, the grammatical rules, you have to think very hard in order to communicate effectively with people. And there'll also be often, for a young child who's exposed to two languages and is maybe going through a stage where they're using those two languages sort of merged together, perhaps even switching languages mid-sentence, they will come across a lot of kind of communication breakdowns, which they then need to repair and fix. So again, bilingualism provides this opportunity to really kind of train up those skills, possibly at a key developmental stage. And that's the basis on which you might argue that bilingualism could have some kind of therapeutic value. Specific to autism, I guess the other thing just to mention is something I briefly touched on in the talk, which is the idea that different people speaking different languages could act as a sort of overt marker for different mental states, different thoughts, beliefs, and perspectives that could help to highlight that difference and sort of remind the child to bear that in mind when they're communicating with other people. In terms of foreign language immersion programs, I don't think there are any published that I know of. I think it might be a bit premature to get to that stage now based on the evidence. It's quite a big commitment to ask someone to sign up to something like that. And I would worry that there could be a risk that you're asking people to put a lot of investment of time and effort into something where it's still very unclear whether it would yield benefits. But it's an exciting possibility for the future.
Great. That's great. And somewhat along those lines, we also received a question about what advice would you give for the generalization of social language skills across languages for bilingual children with ASD. And here's an example. So the students are taught in English at school and their therapy is in English, but during break time they use home languages, which requires this generalization. And there are currently no resources to provide therapy in the home language. So would this be results in a delay in social skills in a language issue as opposed to a generalization to a natural environment setting issue?
I mean, I don't know. It's very hard to break those two things down, isn't it? You know, so we're well aware from the autism support literature that generalization can really be a challenge. So you might have autistic children developing kind of good social interaction skills in a therapeutic setting, but then, you know, when you sort of look at playground behavior or something like that, those things don't seem to have generalized across. And I can see how the language barrier would present an additional obstacle there. However, I'm not sure that the solution here, and this is really, you know, sort of blue sky conjecture, just to be clear, but I'm not sure that the solution here would be to try and also provide whatever support was being offered in the home language in this context, because it might be that actually the language difference between the therapy context and the school classroom context and break time could almost be quite useful as a sort of marker to remind children or to encourage children to work harder to kind of communicate with their peers. So going back to the interview data, there was one quote from a mother who was saying that her autistic child, when he wanted to communicate with his grandmother, who he knew didn't speak English, he would kind of go the extra mile to communicate with her. So I wonder whether that switch out of English in the therapeutic context into the home language in the playground context could also act as a sort of prompt to the child to say, I need to do something different in this context. I need to work harder in this context to communicate with people. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. And when we're thinking about bilingualism, what differences are you aware of or do you know of as they relate to some spoken word or a language such as American Sign Language as a second fully functioning way to communicate?
So on the one hand, being bilingual across spoken English and American Sign Language should and would have exactly the same effects or consequences as being bilingual across two purely spoken languages, in the sense that, you know, the same principles apply, that you have to choose between the two languages, that you have to inhibit whatever is the non-relevant language to the context, that you have to deal with communication breakdowns, that you have to match your language to your conversation partner, and all of those sorts of things are exactly the same. The specific complication probably comes in terms of autistic, so associations between autism and dyspraxia, and kind of in some individuals, sort of motor difficulties and so on. So trying to think whether you would expect, I don't know how they would translate into learning something like American Sign Language or British Sign Language, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I know that for example, sometimes with children with autism and learning disabilities, people use Makaton Sign Language, and that can sometimes be difficult for children with dyspraxia. And so that's something to be borne in mind. But probably if an autistic child is using ASL, it'll be because they have a hearing problem or someone in their family has a hearing impairment. And so, you know, that's the motivation for that language, right? That's a motivation that that can't really be framed in terms of cognitive benefits or dyspraxia or anything else. Like, it is what it is. That's your language. I suppose it would be similar to going up to a family who are French Canadian and saying, okay, well, it's great that you're raising a child bilingually, but actually it would be really better if you could do Spanish English instead of French English, because my study has demonstrated that Spanish English is the optimum language combination. I mean, it's just a ridiculous recommendation to make to a family who are French Canadian. So, so I would expect the same benefits to accrue, and I think that in some ways, that's the family setting, and so then that's the language combination that's being used.
Great, thank you. And then we had a few questions that were child-focused questions as well, so I wanted to ask some of those. And would you expect to see consistent differences in an individual in pragmatic language difficulties across both languages if a child is bilingual? Or would you expect certain types of pragmatic speech, so for example, a pronomial reversal, to differ based on the language currently being spoken? So would you expect a person-based or a language-based pragmatic deficit?
That is such a great question. I think that's a fascinating question. So the short answer is that you would expect consistent deficits across both languages, right? That's the kind of simple answer, because if the difficulty is rooted in some kind of fundamental difference in your approach to communication, social interaction, the purpose of communication, and so on, you would expect that to operate equally across both languages. But there are definitely complicating factors there. So one is that certain languages, so in the example they give of pronomial reversal, some languages will have sort of equivalent phenomena within the language more than others, right? So words that change their format depending on the speaker. Some languages will have more of those. So I'm trying to think. I'm not really a linguist, so I can't really think of any examples. But words where whether an object belongs to a man or a woman would change the word ending for the noun, right? So there might be more like some languages where either that difficulty is more prevalent because there are more grammatical structures within the language that invite that difficulty, if you like, or where that difficulty is less prevalent because the language affords multiple opportunities for practicing that skill and understanding how the choice of language that you use depends on who you are in relation to the person that you're talking to and the thing that you're talking about. So it could go either way. The other thing would be to think about the context in which those languages are being learned. So if one language is being used primarily at home, and one language is being used primarily, or actually, so the example we had in the previous question, one language being used in the classroom and a different language being used in the playground, that might make one language the child's ability, so the classroom language might be better for making concrete requests, or answering questions or following instructions, and then they could be more skilled in the playground language in terms of kind of conversation with peers, making a joke, fooling around, just because those two languages are being used for quite different social interactive purposes. So there you go. There's all the different possibilities I can think of.
That's great, and I think that in part answers some of this next question, but you might have some more to add to it. This person was wondering if you could clarify if children with ASD exposed to bilingualism are more likely to show delays in both languages or not.
So, no. I mean, in a nutshell, children with autism who are bilingually exposed may show language delays, but there's no evidence that they show greater language delays or greater frequency of language delays than children being raised in monolingual households. So in other words, there's no evidence yet, there's no evidence that bilingual children are suffering a kind of language disadvantage. Sometimes it might look like there's a delay because the child's total vocabulary is spread across two languages. And if you only consider their vocabulary in one language and neglect their vocabulary in the other language, then you underestimate their total word knowledge. And that's the only kind of exception.
And when we think about child-based characteristics, do you think that parents with minimally verbal children intentionally limit the number of languages that they expose their child to? And what recommendations would you have in the case of a parent with a minimally verbal child?
So obviously the study that I presented today was a small sample, but looking at that and combined with other studies out there in the field, it doesn't seem to be as systematic as you might expect. So you might naively suggest or naively imagine that if your child is minimally verbal, you as a parent would be more likely to switch to or just stick with just one language, right? Actually, that doesn't seem to be the case. We spoke to some parents who were sort of, well, he's not really saying anything anyway, so we're just going to speak whatever languages we feel comfortable using. You know, there was a sort of certain amount of nihilism about the whole thing. I think they thought it's more important that we're just a happy family, you know. If they felt that their child just probably wasn't going to be a big talker, it didn't seem the most relevant thing anymore. In some ways, I think it's more pressing for parents whose children show a little bit of a delay, and then the parents are very, very keen to do anything they can to minimize that delay and to help their child catch up or something along those lines. And so then there's a real motivation to say, okay, if we stick to English, this could be, you know, this could make all the difference. This could be, you know, really like help our child kind of cross some kind of threshold of language competence that would facilitate their participation in a mainstream classroom, for example. So what I suspect, but you'd need bigger data sets to really confirm this, is that parents of children who have very little speech and parents of children who are totally fluent talkers and never had any language delay might be more likely to adopt or maintain bilingualism if that's an option for their family. And it's the parents of the kids in the middle who might feel more under pressure to change what they're doing as a family in order to promote their child's language. So as I say, there isn't evidence that that's what you should do, though we haven't got the detailed enough understanding of how it impacts across different subgroups for that to be a totally concrete statement.
Great, thank you. And we have another child-specific question. This person is wondering about the role that sensory issues play and how children with autism pick up different languages. So if it's easier for them to communicate if they can cross different languages and pick out the words that they would want to use based on what's easier or potentially more pleasing for them to say and hear. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on sensory issues. Yeah.
This is such a nice idea. I have not ever thought about it in those terms before. I think it's completely fascinating. So I don't know the answer to this. I'm going to completely defer to Billy and say that in your polyglot survey, Billy, we should look at that because that would be really, really interesting. One of the things, so Billy's survey, she's got responses from more than 300 autistic adults. I think about 80 of them were monolingual, but everyone else spoke 2 or more languages, and there were a handful who spoke more than 7 languages. That was as far as the survey went, because it was getting too long a survey. And something that we're really, really fascinated by is that group of autistic people who have chosen as adults to really invest in language learning, and that has become a really important hobby or career choice for them. And I think it would be fascinating to know whether there was a sensory element to that as well, to enjoying, as this questioner says, enjoying the sound or even the kind of feel in your mouth of a particular language. So we will get back to you on that.
That's great. And I know that you have prepared a number of really nice professional development slides, so I will ask you one more question, and then I would like to turn it over to you to present some of that great information that you've prepared. And so this last question we have is, how do you think clinicians should assess bilingual children? Should they be sure to prompt for language skills in both languages? What would you recommend?
Yes, I think we need to be covering both languages in our clinical assessments, particularly where language delay is crucial to understanding that individual's profile. I mean, obviously the ideal situation is that the clinician speaks the same languages as the child, which can be very hard to achieve. I think if that's not the case, then they need to work really closely with the parents to understand how the child is using language in the home and how they're responding to language. So this is a case where it's worth services trying to invest, for example, in a bilingualism specialist speech and language therapist who would really make it their specialism to understand kind of facets of bilingualism and apply those to the context. So they would really have the knowledge of the right questions to ask and the best way to ask those questions in order to understand that family's profile. And in case it's not already completely obvious from what I've said already, I think those questions should include not just questions about the child's language competence, but also understanding of what different languages mean for that family. So what are they using their different languages for? Are they using a particular language when they go to church or to temple? Are they using a particular language with their extended family or in their local community? How are their language choices going to impact their service provision? And there needs to be a really rich discussion between the family and the practitioners about how best to accommodate that family's language profile in the services and supports being offered to them.
Great. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions, and it was great to hear that. And now I would like to, I'm sure we'd all like to hear a little bit about your career development, how you got where you are, and particularly how you expanded your work to include culture and diversity.
Thank you. Okay, let me go back to my slides. So, oh my goodness, so boring. So yeah, I was asked to just prepare a little bit of career stuff, so I'm just going to run through that now. Basically, my career is very original. I've never had a real job outside academia. I started off, my interest in autism came from some voluntary work with children with learning disability, autism, and complex needs when I was at school. And that was what led me to study psychology. I did my undergraduate degree in psychology, I did a master's in psychology, I did my PhD in psychology, and I was lucky enough to get a Economic and Social Research Council postdoctoral fellowship here in the UK. I moved to a new university. I think one of the important career facets that's worth mentioning explicitly is how valuable it is to move universities. Even if you don't want to or can't move cities or countries, moving into a different institution or even moving across schools or departments within the institution that you're in is so valuable because it gives you a really different perspective on your work. I was lucky enough to, so at the end of that fellowship, I'd applied for a couple, I think 2 or 3 grants, and one of them I hadn't got, and there were another 2 where I didn't have a decision yet. And my mentor managed to scrape together some money and give me a 6-month research associate post, which was very lucky, and I'll say a little bit about that later. And I managed to extend that 6-month post to be about 18 months because I took maternity leave in the middle of it. So that was really great. And in the meantime, I managed to win a grant, so that was my Nuffield Early Career Fellowship. Another new university, but the same mentor and another period of maternity leave. And I got a Chancellor's Fellowship here at the University of Edinburgh. This is a kind of tenure track scheme. I was originally based in the Department of Education, and then I moved into psychiatry, and I'll mention that a little bit later as well. And I just recently got promoted to Senior Research Fellow, so that's very smart. So this is the same list of all the things that I've done, but I just wanted to think about the different things that I learned in these different roles, and how if you can try and, a really good thing to do, I think, when you're early in your career is to think about how the different roles that you've had and the different roles that you're applying for translate into skills. And then particularly when you're starting to lead your own research group or to seek your own independent funding, you want to make the best use of those skills. So, for example, I did this rodent project when I was an undergraduate, right? So I did this rodent behavioral project, basically because the guy who was supervising it invited me to be on the project, and I was really flattered, and so I did, even though it wasn't really my interest. But then, so that would have been in about 2002 or 2003, and then like 12 years later in 2012, I moved into the place where I am now, which is the psychiatry department at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm in the Patrick Wild Centre, which is an interdisciplinary research centre, which has a clinical half, which is the half that I'm in, and we mostly work with human beings, but there's also a basic science half, which is all about rodents and cells and things like that. And so suddenly this thing that I did years ago just once as an undergraduate is really helpful again, just in helping me have conversations with my colleagues and just have a tiny, tiny little bit of insight into what their working day is like, and into the kind of priorities and issues that they're experiencing on a practical level. So it's worth thinking about how these kind of choices that you make translate into skills and how they can be applied in the future. And then when you're looking for funding, you're always looking to pull together those diverse strands of skills to position yourself as being kind of uniquely placed to take forward whatever project it is you're proposing. So you're this exceptional individual, not just because of the kind of quality of your work, but the sort of unique pattern of abilities and skills that you can bring to it. And if you feel that your skills are getting a bit monotone, it's always worth thinking about how you can diversify a little bit, even if it's maybe doing something like voluntary work or going on a particular course. So I did a Cochrane systematic reviewing course that was really valuable, but only a week out of my working year. And so those sorts of things can be really important to really set yourself apart from other early career researchers in that horrible competitive quest for funding and jobs. The other thing I wanted to say in this bit was just something about asking for stuff. So loads of the best things that ever happened to me happened just because I asked someone if I could do it. And people are often very nice and say, yeah. So this is a phrase from Northern England, shy bones get nabbed. It means quiet babies get nothing. So you have to yell if you want something. So an example was I did a study visit to McGill University in Montreal when I was doing my postdoctoral fellowship. My husband got a job at Edinburgh, and so he went off to Edinburgh, and then I just had to try and get a job at Edinburgh. So I just emailed bunches of people and said, I need a job in Edinburgh too, because my husband's already there. and they were very generous and helped me apply for funding, supported by the university and things like that. I got my current job in psychiatry because I was in the education department, which is a great department, but it became increasingly clear it wasn't a good fit for the work I was doing. And so I just emailed the head of the department I'm in now and said, hey, can I just move into your department instead? And didn't just immediately say yes, but you know, that's what started the whole process. And another thing I'm doing right now that I'm really excited about and proud of is writing a book with Francesca Happe, and that started because I emailed her and I said, I really, really love your book, but it was published in 1994 and a lot has happened since then. Would you let me help you write an updated version of the book? And she said, oh yeah, great. If, you know, if you're going to do all the work, then that's fab. So I would encourage people to ask for stuff if you want it. And I think there's a couple of things about how you ask that make it more likely they'll say yes. So one is that you should have a plan, but you don't want to have too much of a plan because you don't want the person you're asking to feel that they have no room to make a contribution. So if everything is very, very fixed and detailed, you know, I'm going to come to your department and I'm going to do exactly this list of things and I have a Gantt chart and I'm going to show you how every single day will be spent. If there's something that they want to contribute or influence that feels very, there's no room for them to play a role in it. And the other thing is just to be really, really clear on what you think they are going to get out of what you're offering. So being really honest and upfront about what you think you can contribute and what you're asking them to contribute, and trying to show that that's a kind of fair deal. What's next on my slides? Okay, so this is just a really quick slide to say, here's a list of some of the things I've applied for and I didn't get. So I applied for I applied for this fellowship twice, I applied for this fellowship twice, I applied for this fellowship twice. I didn't get any of these grants. And there's loads and loads, like I could fill slides and slides and slides with all the journal articles and small grants that have been rejected. And now I'm having this really traumatic time where I have students and postdocs who are applying for grants that I'm trying to support, and they're getting rejected for stuff, which is even worse, really. I think I've probably got about a third of the stuff I've tried to get, and that's probably quite normal. So just don't be downhearted if you don't get stuff, and keep going. And the two important criteria are persistence, keep going, and fit, which is why I have this orange stuffed in an avocado, because I just think that's great. Such a good fit, an unexpected fit. Okay, one more thing I wanted to say. So I think people often think that how much you have relates directly to how much you do, and particularly in academia, there's a culture in a lot of countries of really working very, very hard, often on short-term contracts or temporary contracts. You don't have a lot of job security. You might not be being paid very generously. You might be working quite long hours. If you're doing lab work particularly, you're often coming in at the weekends, and you're sort of desperately trying to get tenure. And if you have a partner who's also an academic, it's just double the trouble, really. But people feel like, you know, you have to do a lot if you want to have a lot. And it's very much a kind of one-to-one relationship between these two things. But I think there's a way that you can do less and have more. Ooh, what's it going to be? So it's about your reputation. It's about who you are. So essentially, you can multiply the amount of work you do by your reputation in order to have more. So what I mean is, make yourself the kind of person that people want to work with, and that people are talking about, and that people are saying, oh, well, you should get Marika because she's really great for that. She would be a fantastic contributor to that project. That's what you want people to be saying about you. And that obviously means doing good quality work, without a doubt, but it also means being efficient and prompt and reliable. It means you know, doing all of your action points from the meeting. It means keeping people updated and informed, but not overwhelming them with really long emails that are a bit of a mess. It means putting yourself out there, giving talks, talking to community groups and so on. And before you know it, you find yourself being the kind of person that people are inviting to be part of projects instead of everything having to be, your nose to the grindstone, your funding application, your paper that you're putting out. And that's an excellent way to raise your profile and produce more work and hopefully give more back to the community without being in the office until midnight every night and coming back again at 6 a.m. the next morning, which is not a good idea for your mental health. That was my last slide. I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much for your attention, everyone. My website is there at the bottom of the slide. My contact details are on the site. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, then you would be more than welcome.
Hi everyone, this is Christina again. Sue, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation, and as well as providing us with that invaluable information about career development. I think you touched on a lot of really important aspects there, so we really appreciate everything you did for us today. I certainly learned a lot, and I felt like we had a really good discussion and answer session as well. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you to our working group and Marika and Billy for helping run this session. Everything went swimmingly and was great. Video replays will be available on the INSAR website following our 6th session series. So if you want to go back and review this presentation, it will be available online at the end of the summer. If you simply created a profile on the INSAR website to register, there are many benefits if you actually choose to join INSAR as a due-paying member. You can become an INSAR member by visiting the membership page of the website, and we encourage you to do so. If you have questions or want to get more involved, you can contact the Student Trainee Committee at autism-insar.org. Again, that's Student Committee at autism-insar.org. We hope you've enjoyed this session of the 2017 INSAR Summer Institute Series. Please take a few moments to fill out the comment section after you end your session. We're really eager to see your feedback. Join us next week where Jennifer Singh discusses structural inequalities in ASD diagnosis and services at the intersection of race, class, and gender. Thank you all again for listening and participating. Sue, thank you for your presentation, and we hope to see you all again next week. Thank you.